So we have an excellent panel on the next stage of payments. And it says gateway to data visibility. I guess that's part of it. We're going to broaden that topic a little bit. But before we get started, it's also unusual that two of our panelists are Swedish. And I'm going to give you, we're asked this trivia question, see who in the audience knows the answer to this. So the United States has about 15,000 islands in it, including Alaska and Hawaii. Indonesia, which is the land of 1,000 islands, has 17,000 islands. How many does Sweden have? Any guesses? How many people would say it has more than 1,000 islands? Okay. How many people think it has more than 5,000 islands? Okay. How many people think it has more than 15,000 islands? 2. Okay, what's the high, then who wants to hazard a guess? 258,000 islands. That's one island for every inhabitant of Sweden, I would say. Pretty.
That's why people have boats.
Now we got that out of the way. Okay, so what we're going to talk about, we're going to give you a little context. So payments used to be complicated, but in the scheme of things, relatively simple. So in 2012, 10 years ago, there were virtually 0 terminals. A handful of terminals were connected to the internet. Almost all were connected to, a telephone line. All those Verifone terminals. E-commerce infrastructure was completely distinct. Had no overlap at all, even the database or anything with the POS infrastructure, and less than 10% of personal consumption expense was e-commerce. Less than 10%. Mobile commerce was close to 0. Tender settlement options were basically card and local settlement, local debit scheme. Those are the 2 basic options that you had. Loyalty rewards are basically card points funded by interchange. Nothing at the point of sale. Nothing automated at the point of sale. There was no buy now, pay later. Cross-border was very expensive. It was very risky, and a lot of those transactions wouldn't get completed. And creating a local settlement network, a global local settlement network, was a really difficult thing to do. PayFacs didn't really exist. The only merchant of record, major one that I can think of in 2012 was PayPal. I don't think anyone else had a merchant of record account. And I actually am very proud of the fact that I coined an acronym which stood for, it's LOLLIPOPs, and it stands for Linked Offers, Likes, Loyalty, Incentive, and Promotions on Payment Systems. And that comprised hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ideas. How you're going to link, your search, your identity, and your location, all stuff to an actual transaction optimization, and all those companies failed, including Google Pay. Google Wallet was one of the major ones that a lot of investment went into, and it failed. Okay, so 10 years later, omni-commerce is pretty much universal. That every single merchant is doing omni-commerce. Every terminal now, every new terminal is a smart terminal, and I think well over half of all terminals are probably smart terminals, so all connected to the internet. Every software vertical is now a payments company or on their way to becoming a payments company. There are hundreds of PayFacs, hundreds of them. Tenders, so your settlement options, now that includes account to account. That's a big, fast-growing one. Wallets, buy now, pay later, all the local debit schemes, super apps like Ant, Tencent, all the pays, EBT, crypto, all new. And a high percentage of e-commerce is now global. Marketplaces are now ubiquitous. Those are all global. AML, KYC, merchant risk, those were things that no one really paid any attention to in 2012. And every government is changing their data rules and access, security, permissions. Every government pretty much has that on the table. In the United States, I think 6 states have their own rules around that. Fraud is exploding, just like it was in 2012, but now it's exploding again in different ways. So this is really, really, really complex. And what merchants, they have a very simple goal. They just want to sell their goods and services, and they want someone to pay for it, and they want the transactions to be completed. And so what these three companies, what I want to introduce today, I think is a very important topic for anyone who's an investor here, or you're an entrepreneur, because an entire new category of companies is being created to deal with some of this complexity. And I want to make one point before we turn them over. In 2010, since 2010, by my estimate, about $1.5 trillion of equity value has been created by companies that addressed that transformation from 2010 to today. So PayPal, Ant, Adyen, Shopify, dLocal, Stripe, Square, Affirm, Klarna, Snap, Riskified, Sift, Forwarder. Okay, 1.5 trillion. And what I want you to really focus on, pay attention to, is about to change again, because these problems that I just went through are really complicated and enduring. So the three new concepts that the three companies here, we're going to talk about three new ideas. One is what we call payment intelligence, which is Pagos. One is payment orchestration, which is what Gravy does. And the last is programmable money, which is what Fidel does. And we are very lucky to have three very, very experienced founders here. Klas, who's founder of Pagos, was at PayPal, but was part of Braintree, which is the guts, the intelligence of PayPal. Yes, exactly. John, the founder of Gravy, was also at PayPal for many years, but was also one of the original. You were one of the original engineers at what's it called? What was it? CyberSource. CyberSource, acquired by Visa, and Dev, who's the other Swede, by the way, if you hadn't guessed that. His company Fidel is created, I think, a unique ability. When I first met him, I didn't actually believe it was true, but they have APIs into the auth message of Visa, MasterCard, and American Express, which is very, very hard to achieve. Any one of those, any one, but to have all three is pretty remarkable. So what I'd like to do, here's what we're going to do. We're going to ask each of the founders to just give one example of a service that they provide to a client that crystallizes this to you. So you will come away saying, okay, now I get I describe the problem, how do you solve it? And Klas, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hans. So I think for us, what we're doing is, if your company is selling online to someone or having a billing service that functions online, it is impossible to have a data-driven decision-making if it's tied to payment. No one have that data, complexity is going up, and people just don't have even the most basic information, which makes it very hard to know the answer to questions. Am I doing a good job? Am I leaving money at the table? Could I sell more? Can I reduce my cost? What is my churn? Am I actually going to be able to be in fully compliant, talking about PayFacs? Can I follow all the rules that all the different payments brands are putting out quite frequently? So what we're working with companies on helping them actually be able to make decisions tied to data. And sometimes the data that they are looking for is very fundamental. I'll give you an example. We spoke to a marketplace yesterday, that actually one of our customers, and in the marketplace they're saying, I cannot know anything, or I cannot today know anything about my buyer-seller relationships. I don't know which of the sellers are profitable, which ones am I losing money on, which ones are contributing the most in terms of revenue, which ones are contributing the most in terms of cost, which ones are they racking up the most amount of fraud and chargeback. I don't have any visibility to any of that information. How can I run a successful business when it comes to driving better performance in harder times? I can't, because I don't have that data. And if I were to go after that data from my own system or from my vendors, no matter how I do it, I will still have to build a lot of things myself. And I don't have enough people in my team with the knowledge or the tools or the capabilities so actually executing that.
And how many data sources, when you solve that problem, how many data sources would you say you are typically extracting from?
Well, I mean, sometimes it can be just one, and it's really a black box, which is, or two, depending on how you see it. I have my own system, and I have my vendor system, and if I have only one vendor, I guess you have one black box. But so the combination of two as a minimum, your own system and your vendor system. Mm-hmm. And even so, people have a really hard time trying to understand, what is my performance, what is my data, where can I do better, am I doing a good job, am I doing job.
And what size, what company would be a typical company that you do that for?
I mean, when it comes to us, we work primarily with larger companies, so I would say 50 million in online sales and up. But I think if you're growing really fast and you're below that, would you pay $1 to make $1 or pay $1 to make $10? Probably. Just a question, do you have that sort of knowledge and understanding yet, or does it surface as you grow even further?
And do they have engineering resources focused on this typically at that stage?
Very mixed bag, and the people who do have engineering resources typically need to spend more than they have on just their core business and building what's unique for their company, not tied to driving better performance out of their e-commerce or billing stack.
Okay, very clear. John?
Yes, so very similar in problems that a retailer's facing. As you've heard, things have just got so much more complicated, and you've got what consumers are asking for at checkout is changing. It's no longer, it's not, you can't just get away with accepting credit cards. You look at, for example, the Zoomer Gen Z generation, 60% have bank accounts. Like, the credit cards are not in their top 4 reasons, ways they like to pay, and it's just changing. What consumers are asking for is changing. What's happening on the other side is hiring and retaining payment engineers is getting harder. You can go out on the street, raise $4 million and start an NFT startup. Why would you want to go and work at a retailer on a payment system? So you've got these two things colliding, and what it's causing is a lot of pain in retail. So where we step in is we have built a platform that allows a retailer to take some of this intelligence and turn that into actions. So we have a platform that connects to pretty much every payment system in the world, allows a payment manager to add, change, remove payment options, risk options, and manage that through a no-code layer where you don't need an army of hundreds of engineers to make changes. So we give retailers the flexibility to really move into the markets they need to move to, action the data that's coming from Pagos and others in that space, and really take away the dependency on architecture and architectural debt, which is slowing e-commerce down globally.
And if someone wants to change out their, let's say they have settlement, they're using a PayFac or Adyen or someone to settle in Brazil, and they want to substitute something else or substitute a risk engine, how long does it take?
So on average, across the industry, it takes about 8 months to add a new payment type, and that's generally over it. Not a lot of people have got 8 months when they're fast-moving retail. On average, we're getting a new client live in about 3 weeks. We can add a new payment option to their stack in under 2 weeks if it's a new one to us. So we've really just accelerated that speed to market. One of our clients, 11 Sports, we took them to 2 different continents in 3 months. They can read the case study on our website. They've publicly said it would have taken them 4.5 years to do that. They did that themselves.
And I think both Hans and John spoke about adding payment methods, but in reality, from a technology perspective, it's a little bit more complicated than that, isn't it? As an example, most companies now have a website, they have mobile, but mobile have a tendency to be at least 3 different tech stacks, right? You have a mobile web, you have an Android environment, you have an iOS environment, different teams pushing out code on different frequencies. So it's not just adding one payment method, it's often adding payment methods in 4 different technology stacks. And that's a minimum people might sell on Instagram or through a partner's website or some other platform, and that just add to the complexity. Even such simple concept of as a channel that have different technology components.
All right, so Dev, this I think fits nicely into, because I think this attribution aspect of how do I attribute this, and this customer being clear across all these different manifestations is something you do. But tell us about what else you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from these introductions, there's a lot of complexity being built into the payment system, and what we're working on is essentially creating a programmability across all these disintermediate or segregated systems, let's say, so that you can create event-driven experiences for users that are omni-channel across platform. So essentially, what we've built is a modern connectivity layer that sits on top of the various sort of antiquated data rails of the global card networks, and then we expose that through a modern RESTful API for innovators or companies to then innovate on top of. And you could break it down in 3 core components. Number 1 is the ability to securely authenticate a payment credentials. Number two is the ability to actually capture payment events from those credentials in real time, irrespective of whether it's an online purchase or an in-store purchase or a different platform. And third is the ability to push instructions back onto payment credentials. So essentially, ID verification, data, and payouts. So these three components, I like to see it as read-write capabilities on top of real-time money flow. So these three components combined is essentially enabling companies to build a multitude of experiences, omni-channel experiences, whereby if a particular user transacts at a particular store, particular time, particular category, if all of these things are true, then let's trigger an event-based experience off the back of that, right? To create that experience that is omnichannel and that is holistic across different segments and channels. And just to wrap it up, the way it's sort of manifesting itself is you're starting to transform processes that otherwise wouldn't have been possible, right? And that goes across delivering, digital receipts, something as simple as that, in a sort of omnichannel way, and in an automated way, delivering a loyalty and rewards experiences across segregated systems, delivering attribution, so online platforms that want to attribute spend in an offline environment, as well as things like expense management, doing real-time policy adherence checks, personal finance management, claims reimbursements, lending. There's a bunch of different opportunities or experiences that are being created using these underlying tools.
So I just want to give one example just to make this very crystallize it. You could be a company, you could say, have your employees, instead of getting a corporate card, say, just take any card you want, take a picture of it. Then they could put the logic in to approve expense. Like when you check out here, you get an immediate push reimbursement, push debit reimbursement, immediate real-time reimbursing you for the expense here. So that takes a lot of friction out of the system. You don't have to have a corporate card. You don't have to tie up capital in managing a corporate card. So that's an example of this programmable, allowing, using the existing rails, allowing very customized movement of the money around with permission. So it's actually a pretty interesting idea. So let's go back. Now, one thing I think is interesting, first of all, you all started in Europe. And that's, I think, most people don't realize how different Europe is. But how does that lead you to decide to focus on what you're doing right now, the European experience? You could.
I mean, to be honest, to me, it was sunshine that drove me here. But if I put it in technology, I live in LA, so I think I grew up in a small country. I'm one of the two Swedes here. I lived in Southern California for 23 years, but I think growing up in a small country, you just have a little bit different perspective of borders and opportunities, and maybe don't necessarily think about one country, but let's go after all the countries. How hard can it be? Let's go and conquer the world. So that's been pretty big part of it, of the DNA. I think whether or not you like it or not, but in Europe you have a very heavy-handed regulation around payments and e-commerce and data, and that creates a very different situation for companies building around commerce and payments, and maybe have a little bit of appreciation for that. There are many ways to get to the end result. Some of them may sound very strange from sort of a California viewpoint, but that's the reality, and we just got to deal with it and move on. So that became part of it.
I would say it was harder. It's hard. I mean, each
sure.
country in Europe is a different country.
That is a good point. It is harder in a small country to build a very large company. So being in the U.S. creates a unique opportunity to build that scale that you may not necessarily have if you build a company in Sweden. It is getting a lot easier than it was 20 years ago, though.
But I think, I was brought up in Switzerland, which is an even smaller country, and no, we don't speak Swedish. But I was brought up.
No islands.
We have one island. It's actually owned by Britain.
Nice hockey.
I was brought up in an international community with lots of different people, and as a European, you're kind of brought up to appreciate difference. And I think when it comes to payments, there are a lot of different ways to pay. And I think over here, it's just generally assumed that cards are the best. In Europe, they're not, and they're totally not. And there's shocking stats, 5% of Germans owning cards. And, where I come from, the post office is the #1 bank, right? That's where you generally bank when you're a kid. It's very different in each of these smaller countries, but you impact it much sooner. So for us, like, a conversation with one of our clients will start much earlier in the stage than over here. And I think bringing that, internationalization or international view of the world where everyone is different, that doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other, means you start to cater for the differences. And I think that came with me when I moved here.
And Deb, did you think that in Europe the don't be creepy standard on data is more manifest than in the United States? Like the Americans tend to say, yeah, you can. I realize you're taking all my data and you're going to destroy democracy and all these other things. But in Sweden and Germany and throughout Europe, it's more heavier hand on regulation and data privacy. Or do you not agree with that?
No, I mean, definitely. There's certainly a lot more deliberate sort of thinking around that, but that's because I'd say the regulators have been on it for a little longer than over here. For us, we didn't really, because there was obviously with GDPR kicking in, there was a big transition over in Europe, and for us, we didn't really notice that too much. We saw it obviously, but it didn't change our ways too much, because everything we've done has been based on first-party consent from the very beginning, right? So before you can start accessing transaction and payment information from a specific card, there needs to be a granular opt-in, granular consent captured, and an opt-in. So that didn't really change much for us. The reason we sort of decided to hop over the pond, if you like, to come out here and focus was two reasons. One was we started getting a lot of inquiries from the US in general, and lots of large clients. But second, that was sort of underlying, we looked towards Europe, but Europe is very fragmented when it comes to the payments ecosystem. You have, although Visa, MasterCard, Amex exist there as global sort of processors and networks, every country has their own internal domestic processing systems. So that makes it harder to crack, because every country you enter, you're having to do a new set of integrations and build a new layer of abstraction, but you're only unlocking somewhere between 20 to 50 million users, whereas you come over here, you use the same systems that we've been leveraged since day one, and we're talking 300-400 million, right?
Okay, so we want, and those of you who want to ask a question, you can feel free to ask, and we'll keep talking here. But hopefully we're stimulating thoughts about how this complexity can be abstracted away. So all three of you also are no-code. And what do you think about, into your no-code environment, can you then continue to introduce new ideas? But let's talk about how what is the state, what is the issue with getting access to engineering resources at these, even pretty large retailers, and I don't know how many, maybe 100 retailers in the whole world actually have significant engineering resources devoted to this. But let's talk. You could just riff among yourselves about this issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can start with a few ideas. I mean, obviously, first of all, I think there are two groups: the people who have sort of engineers that build things, and then the companies that have IT teams. Then they typically have a pretty hard time on building anything that they want. So that's one. And then there's never enough resources. I think when it comes to payments, often very complicated, so not a lot of people truly understand it. So even building a business case for some of the payments projects can be quite hard. So that makes some of those projects not that attractive from a roadmap perspective. Then you add regulation and compliance on that, which is even fewer people understand. People have a really hard time on the execution.
But then do you make them configure all this? Because configuration is awfully complex too, given that. How does that complexity go away if it's we give you tools to configure, which is complicated, or here's engineering, make our pre-configured box work?
It double. I mean, it like compounds, right? So there's not a lot of people who know about payments. There's very few cloud engineers in the world. If you just look at Google, for example, they used to charge for their training. They don't charge. They're giving it away for free now. They're actively trying to encourage people to learn how to use cloud. So you've got that, you've got lack of cloud engineers, lack of payment engineers, and it compounds if you try and add it all together. You now got to find a knowledgeable cloud engineer who knows about payments and can configure a system, and good freaking luck, sorry to say. It's just the way it is. And by breaking that down, so now you no longer need the engineers, you're getting the data from here, you have programmer money there, then you can hire a payments specialist who knows about payments, and there are more of those than there are payments engineers. So it kind of de-risks it a little bit, but it doesn't change the fact there's not a lot of people who know about payments, so we need more of those.
Yeah.
I'd say, I mean, we're not fully no code. In fact, it's in our name. It's an API. But I agree with Klas, which is, there's two categories of buyers for us. One are the builders. So in that category, you would have the likes of Google, the Facebook, the Twitters, etc., that know how to work against an API and know how to build products on top of an API. And then you have the buyers. Classically, I would put the large issuers in that category, where when they look at an API, they don't really know where to begin and how to get to the end state. They know what outcome they want to deliver, but they don't know how to get from A to B. And for those categories, what we've done is that we've worked with partners, integration partners, to create package solutions that you can just bring to these clients, and they can do a sort of a plug and play turnkey solution. So that's kind of how we've tackled that.
Going back to the what's changed in 10 years, as you were talking about, I don't think there was a single payments company that had its data in the cloud in 2012. I cannot think of any, none of them. And all of them would have considered that too stressful to have even anticipated. But so let's talk about where the data, because all of you are, you have access to the off message, which is, whatever, 30,000 messages a second or something like that. And John, let's talk about where you get the data from and how you are able to turn that into decisions that need to be made in seconds and in several cases because of the risk profile. But I don't know.
Yeah,
John,
so the data comes from everywhere, right? So, and this is where it gets super interesting in payments. So, you can get credit card data from your acquirers, you can get credit card data from your PSP, etc. But then when you start to have other payment types, you've now got new data coming from places. Some of it settles same day, some of it settles 3 days, some 7 days. You go to Southeast Asia, some that settles 32.5 days later or something like that. So this level of data coming from everywhere needs some way to be standardized, which is partially, what you guys work on. But from our perspective, even as simple as getting a report of what money can I expect in my bank account at the end of day, it's not easy. And as you need to support these what your customers are asking for, that just adds more and more layers of complexity. And I think it's really hard to do that if you have a central data repository. You really need to be sitting out there. You need to be putting, data stores locally, especially now with the new regulations coming in. And, India's there, China's there, Indonesia's following, Australia's grumbling about it. It's not as easy of putting a big database and putting everything into it. It's now just got so much more complicated.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think a lot of the large retailers have sort of grown in a piecemeal fashion, almost reacting to the shift to digital. And you see a lot of organizations that have almost built separate organizations for their e-commerce versus their in-store, completely different systems, different sort of CRMs and payment systems, and they don't necessarily speak to each other. So when a retailer now is pushed to create these cross-channel experiences, there isn't really an easy way, and that complexity is just growing. So it's an interesting challenge, and
it reminds me of a funny time. I walked into a store once. I was trying to buy a jacket. As you can tell, I'm quite big. They didn't have my size, but I saw in the back another row of exactly the same jacket. I said, "Do you have it there?" And like, "We can't sell you that. That's our online stock." I'm like, "I'm in the store. I'm going to give you money, but you can't because your payment systems don't talk to each other." And it happens so often. It's kind of strange in this world, but yeah, having a payment system in two different places, restricting what you can sell to your customers seems backwards to me.
What do you think? So how much have so we went through all the different types of payment tenders or settlements systems, and that settlement optimization. You know what way I like to describe it is that the merchant wants to solve for a very simple equation, which is I just want to sell it, and I'm going to offer any type of settlement system whatsoever. Whatever you want to pay with is fine. But the merchant needs to make a decision. What's the risk? What's the cost? And what's the likelihood of that transaction getting completed? Those three things. And how, give an example of how that's, I think this is right up your alley, but then John, you also do a lot of this too. But give an example of what it used to be this % doing this, but now how much is it shifting to these different tender types or not shifting? Is it still 95% bank card?
Well, I think it's hugely dependent on who you are, right, and who you're selling to. So in some cases, yes. In other cases, it's extremely different, right? That's a function of, is it a consumer, is it an old consumer or a young consumer? Do they live in the city or live on the countryside? Is it actually not a consumer, but a small business behaving as a consumer, putting in their corporate credit card on a SaaS platform in order to pay for your expense example? And then all the components that makes it complicated. You mentioned some of them, but there are even additional components. What do you do if you want to add a payment method that doesn't support refunds? And now you need to do a refund. How are you going to deal with that? You can't actually give them a refund because you don't have the customer data. So you're going to ask them for their bank account and address or send them any information, and things like that just breaks down the whole system.
So are you trying, you're just trying to give that insight to the merchant, not actually solve that problem. You're trying to say, be clear to them about the risks they're assuming versus actually saying you're going to run a refund.
Correct. So we can use one example. There are a lot of people moving to subscription models in a lot of different businesses, and it's very few companies that can actually tie the churn to their order, so they have no clue. They can count churn on the one database and transaction on the other, but they can't actually link the two, which means there's a pretty big leakage going on all the time, and they don't even have the data to make a decision around that. So even the most fundamental components is actually really hard to address, and we're trying to help them with that. So I think once you start looking at that, you'd probably have a little bit less likeliness of adding all these payment methods because it is harder. So you pick more carefully and you're trying to roll it up better. Do I support the same payment method across all my channels? Can I actually do refunds? Is it risk, and am I actually willing to take the risk if I understand the risk that comes with these payment methods? Yes, it's great for top line, but what if the bottom line is actually eating into it? And on that note, buy now, pay me later been pretty popular the last few years, you can say. And I think in many cases, not always, but in many cases, it is increasing the cost of the payment acceptance for the merchant. So are you really getting more transaction at a higher basket value? If you don't know the answer to that, and your margins are thin, can you really afford to drive up the cost of a payment acceptance?
Yeah, and then if you're not adding it all together, like, buy now, pay later, we're seeing these huge spikes in fraud at the moment, so across the system. And yes, a lot of them guarantee you as a merchant against fraud. It still doesn't mean you haven't lost the product. You haven't shipped a product you could have sold to someone else, to a fraudster. It adds up, and like we all love to bash the credit card companies in fintech. It's kind of a hobby that we all have. But the truth is, they built a lot of anti-fraud, a lot of risk protection into the credit cards, and some of the newer payment types that come on board don't have that, and they, we like to complain about chargebacks, but chargebacks were created for a very good reason. And I think like a lot of the newer payment methods have a lot of attractiveness when you look at margins, but you're not factoring in what does this mean to fraud, what does this mean to reputation, and ops. That needs and ops and how that has to roll out. I look at open banking. I love open banking. I think it's amazing, but the customer is pushing money to you. What happens if it wasn't them?
Right. Yeah. I'm often surprised by how few merchants actually make those checks to see if is this the person who's making the payment right now, is this the person, is this actually the card holder, or the person that's receiving the funds, is it actually the card holder? And most of the time it's like you don't want to add friction to the journey, but there are other ways to actually do that and get that verification without adding friction at the buyer journey. And we're having a lot of those conversations today, whereby, could you use, if you've authenticated the user some point in the past, you now have a record that I know that this user owns this card. I've verified that with the issuer's credentials. That's double verified. And I also know which device he's used in the past, right? If it's the same device, location seems to be the location where he usually transacts from, then maybe we take a trust-based approach and let this one pass. If not, then maybe we should trigger a one-time password and have the owner of that card enter the password that it gets sent to their mobile. So yeah.
All right. So just I want to make sure because we're getting a little bit towards the end. There are questions. So the 3 business models here, which I think are all essential. So payment intelligence is helping that merchant optimize for all these complex variables and really understand what's driving and what will improve their margins. Very critical part.
Sell more and lower cost.
Sell more, lose less. Yeah. Right. Then what Gravy, so payments optimization is basically allowing substitutions. It's creating your payment stack is now an erector set. You can take something out, put it back in, and as you get bigger or more complex, your payment stack can mature along with that and optimize and scale more efficiently because the needs change dramatically. And instead of being a big engineering project, you could do that in days in some cases. And then the programmable money is saying, hey, we're going to take the payment rails, the debit rails, the credit card rails. We're going to monitor all those real time with permissions, real time, millions and millions of transactions per hour. And we're going to enable you, a merchant or some other partner, to customize something so that you can keep track of that and push money in and out of that system in highly sophisticated ways, real-time ways. So those are all 3 examples of things you probably haven't heard of, but they're really big, important ideas. So I just want to make sure, has everyone got that clear? Is that clear? Everyone got it? Okay, so anyone have questions to clarify any of these points? Everyone looks incredibly satisfied right now, like you've just finished a fabulous meal or something. Okay, so we're going to let you get on to whatever else you wanted. Anything else you guys want to add to finish up?
Maybe this is not exactly your wheelhouse, but when you talk about receipts and data tied to the payments, you can build some really delightful experiences. And to me, being payments for a long time, one of the things that kind of blew my mind was when Square started connecting the credit card data to receipts. We often take it for granted now, but it's like, wait, I got a receipt through my email because you actually linked my credit card. And you can build a lot of fun stuff just to create a better consumer experience with stuff like that. Once you have it, it's obvious, but before anyone did it, it was like impossible to even envision. And that's a tiny, tiny little piece of the flow, right?
That's a great example. And Square can do that because they control the entire ecosystem, right? They're doing the acquiring, they have the POS, they have the processing. So, but for most other merchants, for Starbucks to deliver that experience is next to impossible. But now with these capabilities, you can actually connect connect the dots. Essentially, if you are able to capture and assign a user to a card token, now every time that card token transacts in store, you know exactly in which store at what time that purchase is happening. You match that information with the information you have in the POS, and you can deliver the same experience in real time. But you have to, there has to be another layer that connects all these different systems. So the systems on their own are not able to do so.
And that's, if we expand then on any given topic, I think tokens is an interesting topic, right? If you can almost figure out the age of a company in e-commerce as a function of their tokenization strategy. So if you go back 10 years ago, everyone would have...
There were no tokens 10 years ago. I mean, hardly.
Well, yeah,
hardly.
That's a good question.
No tokens.
Most people wouldn't tokenize their cards, meaning you had to enter the information every time. But the ones who did, they would store it in-house. With that came the rise of PCI certification, which is a pretty big deal for everyone selling online with cards. Then if you go 5 years ago, very likely you would tokenize with your payment processor. That is no longer true for a lot of merchants. They tokenize it with third parties, and it could be for technical reasons, it could be compliance reasons. Now the card schemes are jumping in and saying, you know what, we're going to tokenize the transactions for you, creating even more complexity and more fragment that somehow needs to be pulled together by someone.
I mean, it's fascinating. Like, I think you've got now you as a merchant, you're dealing with perhaps your own tokens, you're dealing with PSP's tokens, and now you're adding network tokens in as well. And the funny thing about it is, like, what token am I supposed to use for you to actually get a payment transaction to work? And it's not always obvious. Just because a network token exists doesn't mean it's going to work. And that's what we're seeing across different countries, different banks. I think there's the data needs to come in, but the way to action against that data needs to be there as well. And I think it's solved the problem, I suggest, for the banks. It's not necessarily solved it for the merchants, and it's made merchants' lives far more complicated.
Can you repeat that? No.
Yeah.
The one drawback of being outside, right?
All right, we have a question, 2 questions. Go ahead. No, it's not in the off message. Not in the off message at all. And that's one of the things Square did, is they created a way of capturing that by saying, "Want your receipt," and now we have the data about the SKU.
But with the authorization message, you get enough data points to be able to do that matching in real time, right? So you would get the card ID, essentially, the timestamp, the merchant ID, the authorization code, which is a unique code for that purchase, and that can be matched against the information you have in your POS. So for a Starbucks, if they have access to both, they can do that matching and deliver. Now they know with the card that this was Joe, and then they know that you made a purchase at this particular Starbucks.
The merchant can, but not someone else. In other words,
Exactly.
the merchant has both.
Yeah.
The 2 things. Sir, you had a.
I was going to step back, and we're talking a lot about Web 3.0 and the decentralization. I'm just curious how that's going to impact the payment structure. Is it going to change a lot, or is that something you guys are already starting to think about, or is that 10 years out, so that's next person's problem?
Do any of the 3 of you say that Web 3.0, and you can define it any way you want to, but do you think that'll be more than 0.5% of transactions in 3 years?
It depends.
Yeah. I mean, broadly speaking, no,
Yeah.
because that's a big threshold in some verticals, possibly. I mean, there is a lot of, or used to be a lot of money slushing around in a lot of different brands that want to convert themselves into a payment method for obvious reasons, or even if they're not the payment method, they want to help in and out of the system with the funds. But that's a big number in general.
It does depend on who in the environment, right? So already now you've got, big brands rolling out NFTs, and some form of crypto stablecoin attached to that. So I think it will be part of it. Will you buy your groceries every week with cryptocurrency? No. Will you potentially rent a property in a different country with a cryptocurrency? Maybe.
Yeah, good. I think it's actually interesting. One of the rules I have on payments, having been around payments for 30 years now, is that the things that take hold in payments, you compete against transactions that don't happen. In other words, if you compete against, I use MasterCard Visa at the hotel here, like it works. When was the last time your Visa card didn't work? But if you said, okay, well, Square got started because like food trucks, you couldn't get a merchant account. Or eBay, you couldn't pay, eBay merchants couldn't get a merchant account. And Alibaba got started because the merchants in China were too small to get a China CUP account. So you step into that void and you solve that. Now you have an ecosystem, and your ecosystem can expand. Once you have a few million users, there's all kinds of stuff you can do. But if you start and saying, I'm going to beat MasterCard and Visa at this, good luck.
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, to your question, there could be a massive disruption around payments. On the other hand, it seems if you take PayPal and Square or Block, I guess they've been quite successful in capturing sort of the entry of taking money in and out of the cryptocurrencies that people do. So then, are they winning, or are the new people that are disrupting? But if they are going to disrupt, to your point, they got to build something much more than just a payment scheme, right?
Or focus on transactions that, like saying, okay, I want to sell electronic goods and I want to sell electronic fencible goods in East Africa, where huge risk of fraud and fencible goods, and so good luck on that. So those transactions don't happen. So that's something you say, yeah, it's a $1,500 purchase or something, and I can make it so that I eliminate the risk in that transaction through some sort of very clear identity system. That's type of thing.
Yeah, we're going back to your original comment about cross-border. I think there are certain channels or between certain countries where it's a huge opportunity. But if I'm in the US and sell to Canada, I don't really have a problem, so I don't really need crypto. But if I'm in Peru and selling to Taiwan, maybe that is the only way I can
even
build
Colombia.
the future.
You're in Peru selling to Colombia,
Yeah,
right?
even that's
Yeah.
true.
All right. I think we have satisfied. All of you look immensely pleased. And so we will end the conference on that note and look forward to the $1.5 trillion of value is going to be created when we reconvene. Thank you.